Why would you waste your time doing something great for God? Now, that may seem like a very odd question to be asking, but as you'll find out on this week's show, it's a very serious question. I'm your host, John Waters, and this week on Wonderfully Weird Living, Pastor Drake Hunter will talk about what success means for the Christian and how we must go beyond trying to do something great for God. Drake Hunter is senior pastor at Elevating Life Church in Fort Morgan, Colorado, founder of the nonprofit 4Dimensional Living, as well as the author of 3 books, including his latest, Wonderfully Weird. Now, this week's edition of Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake Hunter. We do welcome you back once again to Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake Hunter. I'm your host, John Waters, and Drake, in the opening, the introduction to the program today, I asked the question, why would you waste your life doing something great for God? And I'm sure that there's many of our listeners out there right now saying, now, wait a minute, what are you talking about? That's what we're supposed to do, yes, is achieve great things for God, isn't it?
Yeah, many Christians come to me and when they ask me that question, and I said, well, why would you waste your time, as you just shared, doing something great for God? Because I said, our responsibility is not to do something great and, to do something phenomenal, to do something great. Our responsibility is to do the impossible, because God is the one who is great. Jesus is the one who is the goodness. But through that greatness, being anchored in that greatness of God the Father's plan, building our character through the goodness of Jesus, then it's through those means, through that system, that spiritual divine system, that then allows us, if we just trust in God, to truly achieve the impossible. The impossible being like reconnecting with God, being with your fellow neighbor in a way that God designed that relationship to be, to truly do something impossible. And that is our calling, if we think about it. Because so many people are again saying, wouldn't it be phenomenal to do something for God? Well, there's a lot of great things happening out there in the sense of how society and culture defines it. But let's lean on into our faith here, and let's be with God and others and really, really think about that, because we want to do the impossible. And the impossible is truly being with God and with our neighbor in a way that's going to make the world a better place to be for myself, for others, for everyone. Does that make sense?
It does, and it kind of takes me back to last week when we talked about Matthew 19:26, where in the parable of the young rich man, yes, where Jesus says, with man this is impossible, but with God. But with God,
that's right,
all things are possible.
Yeah. There's the great commandment, with God, and of course we have to get with people too, because, before becoming a Christian, I would say before becoming a Christian, it would be impossible for me to love people the way I love today, because I literally hated people. I can even say this. I could probably even say before I was a Christian, I even hated God. I might even said I don't believe in God, but because I hated God, obviously there was something there. But then when I leaned into that, and then I repented, became, made that decision to truly be born again and then follow Jesus, the impossible then happened in my own experience, my own reality. And it's so true. I want to do something impossible for God, not something that's just, let's say, great or even good. That belongs to God the Father and God the Son.
So if I'm understanding correctly, doing great things is something we can actually do in our own power. But to achieve the impossible, we need, right, it comes from God.
And how we define greatness in the sense of society and culture, yeah, we see it all the time. Business, open any business journal or read a business blog, and they're doing some great things. And we say that as Christian, look at that, or wow, isn't that great? And of course, in context, that's fine, but we're talking about in the sense of the faith. We're not called to do great things for God. God is great. And we are to achieve the impossible. And that is what success is for the Christian. Because that's another challenge, isn't it? Where so many people are trying to define what is success in faith. Of course, we get to Hebrews chapter 11 and all that, and we see all the people of faith and how they achieved the impossible. And there's some definitely some lessons through Hebrews chapter 11, that whole book. But we have to define what success is. Well, first and foremost, it's being that faithful person. I think of King David. He was a man after God's own heart, and he achieved the impossible. And we see, of course, all great saints in the past and even now what they're doing. So success for the Christian, make this very clear, is achieving the impossible. And with that, the impossible being with God and with others.
With faith.
With faith.
Okay. All right. So that's the setup
Yes.
for where we're going today. And you preached a message this past week at Elevating Life Church with this thought in mind. And in that message, Drake, you presented the story of the disciples out in the boat, and
Yes.
we know it as Peter walking on the water, and that story to set up the message and the points that you wanted to make that we're going to make today too. So with your permission,
Yes.
can I read that story?
Oh, absolutely. It sets up out of Matthew 14, I'm assuming. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, please.
All right. So
Yes.
Matthew 14, starting at verse 22. And this is the NIV. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And this was after he fed the 5,000.
Right after. That's right.
Okay. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. And I want to read on a little bit because there's some important points here. But when he saw the wind, this is Peter, but when he saw
Yes.
the wind,
Yes.
he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me."
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and I didn't use that on Sunday intentionally, but it's a great, it's a great verse that we need to mention today because this will close out that whole experience. We intentionally did that. So, it's going to be interesting to see. Let's look at this story. That was Matthew 14, verses 22 through 30, correct?
30, yes.
30, all the way through 30. So, and we know that narrative or that story. And yes, it's a narrative that followed the miracle, the impossible miracle, if you will, of feeding the 5,000. And what's significant here is that's in Scripture, that's 5,000 men, but we know there was women, there was children. So approximately, we'll say 15,000 people that was fed with barely nothing. That little lunch that little boy brought, and then many leftovers after that. And this is so important because Jesus is teaching on the impossible, and there were all the apostles. And we can say disciples, we'll use that term as well, but they were there, and Jesus was teaching. Now, he's instructing, so informing, instructing, but it's that next piece that we need to understand when it comes to Peter's experience that's so significant for the Christian. Because we can be part of the crowd. We can be part of the multitudes, hear the lessons week after week after week. But if we never apply it, what Jesus has taught through his teachings, we never step, let's say, out of the boat, and we'll talk more about that in a minute here, then we are just passively in our faith. And we, in the sense of who we are, if we never take action, we will never accomplish the impossible as we see Peter doing, even though we see him with a little bit of doubt, fear, everything that is, but he still, stepped out of the boat. And the whole point of that verse is when Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, he began to sink.
Right.
And then he refocused, because the issue is never the problem, it's how quickly you can refocus and get your eyes back on the purpose of Jesus so that you can truly, truly do the impossible.
Keeping your eyes on the wonderfully weird commands of Christ.
Yeah, his teachings and who he is, and in the sense of his role and responsibility as the Son. We're children of God. He was the Son of God, and it's our responsibility to keep our eyes on Jesus. And of course, when we do that, then he can teach us through those commands that we see, those wonderfully weird commands that are uncovered in the Gospels that parallel the teachings that Moses did back in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And it's remarkable. But take your eyes off of Jesus, and I promise you, you'll sink every time. The key, the secret of doing the impossible is keeping your eyes on Jesus and not allowing distractions or false prophets and everything that Jesus teaches about not to get us off course, and stay focused. Stay focused, stay focused, stay focused.
Well, here before we're done today, Drake, you're going to give a recipe for that. But before we do that, let's go back to this story a little bit and talk about what was actually going on as these disciples were out there on the lake. You know, as you said in your message on Sunday, we see the nice little pictures in the Sunday school classrooms of a nice glassy lake and the boat out there, which is not at all what this was.
No, not at all. And I think you read the NIV. The King James gives a little bit more of reality to what this story is all about. But it's challenging because if we're reading it that way, it becomes very soft. And in our culture, we're familiar with that. We want to soften things up, but at the same time, we've got to see what the reality is. So I'll let you guide us through the scripture, and I'll make comments, and we'll have fun with this. How's that sound?
All right. Well, I went to the King James Version as you were saying that, and verse 24 in this, I think, sets it up well, because this is after Jesus has sent them out in the boat, and it says, "But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary."
There you go. There you go. That's a great interpretation, even in the sense of trying to get it into our mind's eye, because that's our ability, right? To try to see this experience, this reality in our mind's eye, and that just gives a more vivid understanding. But we can even go a step further and understand that this is a storm in the midst of a very, very big body of water, a lake. That we know this. They were traveling at this point from the time Jesus presented the boat, got them into the boat, to where they're at now, 9 hours. We do know that.
So they were tired.
They were tired, and they left, and perhaps it was calm, whatever, but they got themselves in the middle of the storm. Now I'm a fisherman. I love to fish. You know that, John? And I recall being in Lake Michigan. It's been about 20 years ago now. We were in a small 15 passenger boat, if you will, fishing for stillhead, and we were out in the middle of nowhere, and this storm came up. And my goodness, I can kind of relate here, because wind was coming everywhere. Lightning was all over the place. And I was like, I don't know if we're going to get back. It was 21 miles from where we were to get back to land. And we had motors. We had, like the disciples, skilled people in the boat. But man, I can relate, because I was scared. I was freaked out, because I'm a good fisherman, but what I'm not is a good mariner, or I'm not great with the boat. And so I was relying on other people. And wind was coming everywhere. Just like in this narrative here, you can see the storm, feel the storm, and wind was coming at every direction. A word that should come to mind, it was chaotic. It was dysfunctional. And I think we all can understand with circumstances and situations that we find ourselves oftentimes in the storm. Good night. Right now, with the election, what's happening with all of that, and what's going on with the COVID-19, and it just seems like, my goodness, it's coming from every direction. Yes, Here's Matthew 14. Here's the storm that they're experiencing at this point.
All right. Well, it goes on to verse 25. It says, and in the fourth watch of the night, and as you said, this is 9 hours into it. I've seen translations that say about 3 o'clock in the morning is when this was.
Yes.
In the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a spirit, and they cried out for fear.
Now here, John, is you used a great example. I for some reason I see this. I'm sitting in Sunday school here, and I see the felt board, and you see the lake that's placed there, the little paper, figures and all that, and here comes Jesus, and it's so calm.
Yeah, a glassy scene. Yeah.
And of course we want to see Jesus as this tender, soft, Savior and
the GQ Jesus.
Yeah, I guess so. But nothing wrong with that in his place. But we need to understand what the reality is. And yes, he was walking, but again, going back to in the midst of that storm where you see perhaps this silhouette and then walking up on water. And
on the waves. And
you can see why they would be terrified. It's a ghost. NIV says it's a ghost. Perhaps I think in my visualization of this, perhaps the disciples thought they were dead and they themselves were ghosts, and then they see this ghost. Are we dead? Because people are terrified of death. We know that, and so yes, again, here comes Jesus on the water in the storm.
I'm going to go back now to the NIV. This is after they cry out in fear, verse 27. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. And what a lesson there for us.
Yeah, and that's the command of fear, not that just came to my mind. We have to understand. But take courage, what is courage? And just so direct, it is I. And we need to be so clear on who Jesus is. That's why those teachings, those commands of Christ are so important, because when we are in the midst of the storm and we have these teachings, these commands, if you will, in our heart, then we need that voice, that encouraging voice that comes with that experience. And when you understand those commands, and that's the key word, understand, then you can apply them in the storm, because it is Jesus. It is I, Jesus said there in verse 27.
I want to read the next two verses together, and then we're going to go into that recipe that you gave on Sunday.
Okay.
Verse 28, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Verse 29, come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now, in your message on Sunday, as you preached this, you gave us a series of 4 things that come directly out of this, that if we're going to be successful in achieving the impossible for God,
right,
that we have to put in place. So I want to throw these out there one at a time and have you talk about them.
Okay, let's do that.
So step number 1 is you've got to ask.
You've got to ask. You see, Peter, we got to make sure we see this experience in our mind's eye again, because don't forget, there was all the other disciples in the boat, but it was only one, Peter, who stood up and asked. And we see that at the end of this narrative here, the story, and so he did something. Every go back to the boat, all the disciples were being passive. But it was one, Peter, who asked. So you have to ask, and we must understand that we must ask, because if we don't, we have not, because we ask not. And so we have to understand, again, our responsibility in that great commandment with God. We have a role and responsibility, as we see Peter here, and the greatest role and responsibility we have is trust. Trust in the Lord. And we do that with others, of course. And, we have to get past the fear of that so that then we can ask. Because it's the fear that keeps us sitting perhaps in the seat at church, or, we're inspired. We want to do something. But as quickly as that comes, when we, let's say the storm is over, we're out of it, we're no longer, in the midst of all that, it goes away. And so we have to ask. It is key, because that's exactly what Peter did in this story. He replied to God. And again, we need to understand that all the disciples were in the boat together. And that night, John, if you think about that, if they chose, every one of them had the choice. They could have been, as I love how it's Dr. Gibbs. If you've heard that name, Dr. David Gibbs, he preaches this message called water walkers. So there could have been 11 other water walkers, as Dr. Gibbs puts it. I love it, that night, but only one person asked, and that was Peter. And so, again, we can come up with excuses, because I think we know the night that this happened, it wasn't a great night to even stand up in the boat, let alone step out or ask God and then step out. It was a miserable, miserable night. And so important to understand that. So does that help?
Yeah, you've got to ask, and ask in faith.
Yeah, can you see, let's say, Matthew, Mark, and all the other disciples sitting in the boat and kind of looking at Peter and saying something like the effect of, let's say, they're probably saying something, we experience this all the time, John, in our craziness sometimes, but speaking to Peter, could you see him? Would you just sit down, Peter? Mm-hmm. What are you talking about? Just sit down. Tonight, you don't want to get out of the boat tonight, but we got to see what Peter did here. It's huge, because of one person asked, he did the impossible. Now, we got to understand that Peter is now reacting off of that teaching that he just received hours prior with feeding the 5,000. He received the message, but he was crazy enough to take that message and do something with it. Mm-hmm. And he believed it. And when he believed in it, he took action. And when you have belief plus action, you have faith. And we see Peter having incredible faith the night that this happened, achieving the impossible, walking on water.
All right, so step one in achieving the impossible is you've got to ask. Step two, you have to get your eyes off the storm.
You have to get your eyes off the storm. Now, John, I shared this on Sunday. If you and I would have been in the boat, now we consider ourselves men of faith, I would have said something like this. Yes, I want to go water walking. We'll say it that way. I want to go water walking tonight. Mm-hmm. But, however, whatever word you want to use there, Jesus, this would have been my comment. Can you just stop the storm? Can you get the circumstances better, and then probably be real nice about it, please? God, I shared this on Sunday, and hopefully it wasn't misinterpreted, but God is not going to fix the circumstances. That's what man does. You see, Adam and Eve are the ones that caused the circumstances or the problems to get us out of the garden. And isn't that the issue often is we have all of these circumstances because of the problem of men, because of the problem of sin. Well, God's already taken care of that. The name is Jesus, mm-hmm. and his responsibility has already been taken care of. So our job is not to fix everything. Our job is to turn it over to God and say, why don't, but God says this to us, why don't you leave the mess in my hands rather than you trying to fix everything, and you need to get your eyes off the storm and then trust in me, and I promise I will fix it. So we got to get our eyes off the storm. And so if we don't, then what? Exactly where we're at with many circumstances and situations with many people.
Like politics and pandemics right. and things like that. So that's the wonderfully weird command of Christ known as hear God's voice, getting your eyes off the storm.
And that's important because here we go again. We've got this, step number 2, if you will, get your eyes off the storm, and which equals, or it's through the teachings that God gave out of Matthew chapter 11, hear God's voice. Now we know this is very common in the faith. God is not in the midst of the storm, you need to hear the whispers of God through the teachings of Jesus, and really lean into those those teachings so that you can understand what's going on in the midst of the storm, and keep your eyes on Jesus. If not, you're going to sink. And so we've got to understand that. And I love this command, John. Hear God's voice, because what it will do in your character, in your being, if you will, is produce a character trait that's so necessary, known as being attentive, being awake. Rather than, if that's not in place, we're distracted all the time and we allow the storm to get our eyes off of Jesus. We allow the circumstances to pull us away. And then what happens is we become a very distracted person. And if we keep this command in place, hear God's voice and be attentive, the issue is never the distraction or the problem. The issue is how quickly can you get refocused and get that attention back into your being so that you will not sink and you keep your eyes on Jesus. And we need to hear that. The issue is not the storm. It's how quickly, when you get into a storm, that you can get readjusted and get your eyes back on the one you called your Lord and Savior, to get you to fix the mess, if you will.
So the first two steps in achieving the impossible, you've got to ask.
Yes.
And you have to get your eyes off the storm. And Drake, we have achieved the impossible here in that we've hit our time limit for this week. So we're going to do this.
Okay.
We're leaving this as a cliffhanger because there are two more steps involved in this. So you're going to have to tune back in next week to Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake to find out what steps 3 and 4 are. And so everybody loves a cliffhanger, right?
Yes. Oh, I do.
Absolutely.
I'm curious now.
All right. So be sure you join us again next week as Drake will give us steps 3 and 4 of this recipe, if you will, for achieving the impossible. Well, Drake, thank you so much once again for your time and insight. And I look forward to the second half of this program.
Oh, thank you. And you're very welcome.
Thank you for joining us once again this week. If you would like to learn more or have any questions or comments, please feel free to email Pastor Drake at wonderfullyweirdliving@gmail.com. To obtain your own copy of the book Wonderfully Weird, please log on to www.wonderfullyweirdliving.com and click on the button that says Buy the Book. Now, for Pastor Drake Hunter, I'm John Waters, wishing you a wonderfully weird week and a happy Thanksgiving.